Hello guys, good day. So this is me, Kurt Zeus, and for today's video lecture, we will be discussing all about government and citizens, globally interconnect world. So this is a journal article written by Hans Schattle. So our task is to discuss the article written by Hans Schattle. So basically, the video lecture would include a summary of the article. So please take note. I only handpick some of the concepts written by Hans Schattle. So it's your task as well to read them again kasi madaming mga terminologies na hindi ko sinali dito. So it's basically a wrap-up, a summary. Then another thing, some of my insights are not coming from the source. So these are my personal insights, no? So this is not reflected on the source or the article na sinulat ni Hans Schattle. So let's get it started. So ano nga ba yung main issue dito, no? So the main issue before the diagram is that Hans Schattle provided now a scenario of political globalization wherein we define political globalization as an increased interdependence of nation states when it comes to politics. Now, that is political globalization. But the main issue here is medyo nasasapawan siya ng economic aspect. Although hindi siya nasasapawan because economy and political science go hand in hand, they coincide with one another. And nangyari dito is nagkaroon na ng imbalance. Now, if you remember yung discussion natin kay Max Weber, yung introduction, di ba, the society is composed of three main institutions wherein we have your market, your society, and the state. Or rather, we have now yung three aspects of or disciplines that we need to understand the society, di ba? Economy, social, and political aspects. Now, nangyayari kasi dito is that sort of, when you talk about political globalization, nasasapawan ngayon ng market, yung economy, yung responsibility ng politics at ng society natin, which is something that is wrong kasi nagkaroon ngayon ng imbalance. And more likely, it would now challenge the concept of your state looking into a global perspective. So, to give you an example, may head starter na tayo. So, more likely, ang nagde-determine ngayon ng globalization would now be your companies. And it challenge already your nation states. So, ganun yung konteksto, no? Sabi nga ni Karl Marx that human behavior is determined by economics, or what we call as economic determinism. Economics determine everything, and that is something that we should look into. Okay, so there are four themes of the article. First is Hans Schattle cited the definition of a state, and later we could now see it attempts now to challenge globalization, attempts now to challenge yung konteksto natin all about the state. Then later he had defined neoliberalism and how it challenges the modern day state, yung state na na-define na natin dun sa unang lessons natin, as well dun sa lecture natin sa global politics. Then he provided a case, economic and political integration, the case of the European Union. Then the rise of international law and universal principles. Then states as targets of globalization. Now, first things first, we have to define the state, no? So again, na-define naman na natin yung state dati, but let's just look into the article. Now, there are a lot of definitions, I just handpick few. So first, we have Max Weber, no? So, ang daming ano dyan, you could pause it and read it. But here's something, no, to look into state and globalization. Ito, claim to the monopoly, or rather, successfully upholds a claim to the monopoly of legitimate use of physical force in the enforcement of its order. Now, this definition basically pertains to the power of the state towards sovereignty, na dapat siya lang yung mag-monopolize, siya lang dapat ang may karapatan to use legitimate physical force of power in order to probably maintain or stabilize yung order dun sa kanyang bansa. However, when we look into globalization, it attempts to challenge this definition. Bakit? Kasi nakikita natin ngayon, we now have your international organizations. So, nagkakaroon ngayon ng plurality. Katulad dun sa sinabi ko. Kung yung state lang may karapatan, the monopoly to use power, bakit minsan nakikisawsaw yung United Nations? But it's not just on your international organizations, but as well when it comes to other international actors such as your MNCs or your TNCs, yung mga multinational corporations natin. Bakit yung McDo sort of nakikisawsaw na siya? Then we also have your auxiliary mercenaries, for instance, yung Blackwater sa Iraq, di ba? Why they are now involved when it comes to security. It is supposed to be the state, di ba? Kaya it challenges now the concept of state, or rather globalization would now challenge yung function nga ba ng state. Yung kay Hedley Bull naman, basically, it defines the state. There's formally define the state, just like yung kay Henry De Leon. Kasi when we define the state according kay Henry De Leon and similar kay Hedley Bull, they enumerated the 4 elements of the state. Makikita natin dito sa naka-bold, no, na letters. So we have government, sovereignty, this would now pertain to territory, then people. Similar dun sa pinrovide ni Henry De Leon, basic policy 101, there are 4 elements of the state wherein we have people, territory, sovereignty, and government. Now, again, these elements are being challenged by globalization, lalo na yung konteksto ng sovereignty. Kaya nagkakaroon ngayon ng plurality. Then, lastly is I included yung definition ng nation versus state. However, I provided an argument ni Ernest Gellner. Yung sinasabi ni Ernest Gellner is that we have this context called nationalism. So sinasabi ni Ernest Gellner, nationalism holds that the political and the social unit should be congruent. Dapat magkaisa yan. And basically, para siyang yan yung spirit. The state could not exist without this concept called nationalism. Basically, this would now unite the state. So, combination of nation and state. When we look into globalization, nationalism sort of divides the world. So, nagiging divergent siya. It's a factor that would now diverge your countries. So, makikita natin yung konteksto nito when it comes to globalization as a unifying factor of nation states. No? So, up to now, there will still be divide because of this context or concept. Now, the second theme, according to Schattle, is now neoliberalism. Now, again, na-encounter natin siya sa global politics, sa global governance. Or rather, na-encounter natin to sa global economy, di ba? That neoliberalism is a modified form of liberalism. Or rather, it's an economic ideology that would now promote your free market capitalism. So there are 3 things to check when we talk about neoliberalism. It promotes privatization. So yung ownership of kunyari yung mga main sectors natin from public na pupunta siya sa private sector. Deregularization. Inalis na natin yung government in regulating the prices. It should now be the companies. Then free trade. Alisin natin yung government restrictions when it comes to tariff. Now yung idealism kasi ng neoliberalism, they carry out yung main notion ng ating liberal, yung mga classical economics natin na in order for our economy to develop or to progress, dapat minimal lang yung intervention ng government. Hayaan natin yung private sector na gawin yung kanyang task at doon nalalago yung ekonomiya natin. So in a Republican point of view, ang tawag natin dyan is fiscal conservatism. So yung function lang ng government will be in terms of national security, yun lang yung mga functions ng government, no? At yung kung naalala niyo yung analogy ko dun sa master and the slave. Kung walang nakahigpit or walang nagbabantay, nakahigpit dun sa leeg ng isang worker, the worker would now be more productive and more creative. And because of that, basically mas madaming outcome or output yung kanyang nagagawa. So, ganun yung konteksto ng neoliberalism, no? But the problem here is that unti-unti na nawawala yung power ng government. And looking into our lesson, global politics, ang nangyayari dyan is that nasasapawan na siya ng economic factors, no? So, unti-unti na nawawala yung function ng state. Now, yung effects ng neoliberalism, obviously, it weakens the state. However, there are some, this would now bring us, bakit nga ba hanggang ngayon may neoliberalism? And here are some terminologies that would now describe yung trend ng neoliberalism ngayon, no? So first is we have the Washington Consensus. So actually, this is now an agreement or consensus between countries that would now emphasize on the features of neoliberalism. So countries would now agree that, sige, we will now deregulate our markets. We will now promote privatization when it comes to our own sectors. Then we will now impose free trade. Now, sees globalization as imposing forced choice upon states. Now, the problem with your Washington Consensus, dahil ito ngayon yung New World Order, ito ngayon yung trending sa globalization, sundan nyo na lang. Kasi if you will not conform, you will be left behind. So ang konteksto dito is kung hindi mo susundan itong Washington Consensus, mali-left behind ka. At anong consequence nito? So in terms of your economy, hindi ka aasenso. Kasi ito ngayon yung susundan mo, free trade. And basically, who holds the power, basically sila yung masusunod. So this would now be the United States, for instance, di ba? So nakikita natin yung sa North Korea, di ba? They are still in us, although this is just an example, not my personal insight. Kunyari would now be North Korea. Dahil ayaw mo i-open yung market mo, ayaw mo mag-open ng market mo. So ito yung gagawin namin. Same with Iran, di ba? With all those sanctions. So yun yung Washington Consensus. So this is actually an agreement. Now, looking into the trends of neoliberalism, Schattle provided two concepts cited from other scholars din, no? So we have this political economist, Thomas Fried. So may sinasabi siyang golden straitjacket. Now, because of neoliberalism, this is what is happening to our states. States are then forced into policies that suits the preferences of companies. Now, look dito ang neoliberalism. Maliit na ngayon yung function, yung relevance ng government. And we look into the increasing role of the private sector, yung mga companies natin. Ang nangyayari dito is that because of free trade, etc., the openness of market, at lumalabas dyan, economic determines everything, states are forced into policies that suit the preferences of companies. Hindi na ngayon yung state yung magdidikta, yung mga companies natin ngayon. And what is wrong with this one, guys? Let us look into the nature of your states and your companies or your businesses. Ang nature kasi ng state class is basically towards public service. Ang nature ng companies natin is basically towards profit. So, nangyayari dyan is that, di ba, for the public, ang nangyayari dyan is that the state will now shift from public service into profit. And what is wrong? We're not already focusing yung function ng state, which is now for the general welfare, for the public. Pero nag-shift na siya towards yung mga interest ng mga individual. So, private interest na ngayon yan. And what's the problem with that one? Sino na ngayon na mag-provide na interest ng public? So, yun yung nagiging konteksto niyan. So, for instance, would now be some companies. Although, ano bang problema kung minimension ko to dito? I'll just not state para ma-problema tayo. There's one company, kunyari, a sweet company, di ba? Company that produces sweets. Now, ang nangyari doon is that they will now determine yung policies ng isang bansa. So, for instance, would now be sa Africa. So, the state, parang binili na siya ng company na yun, yung sweet company na yun. At nakikita natin ngayon na wala na silang pakialam towards the welfare of the people. So, for instance, when it comes to labor, they will now exploit yung laborers dyan, even the resources. Then, kukunin nila yung resources na yun dun sa bansa nila. Then, they will now generate it into their final product. So, wala silang pakialam kasi yung konteksto nga ng companies na yan would now be yung kanilang selfish interests. Although it's hard to discuss, mas maganda kung i-mention ko yung pangalan pero mahirap na, no? So yun yung nangyayari, no? So ang nangyayari ngayon is states are forced to serve into the interest of the few rather than the interest of their people. Yun yung nagiging mali na when we talk about the golden straitjacket. Medyo magulo yung example ko, no? But dito pa lang, no, nakikita nyo, no? Then, the second would be in terms of electronic herd. So, ito yung meaning ng electronic herd, no? So, treat whole countries the same way companies are treated. So, yan yung isang outcome ng neoliberalism. So, it questions now the concept of sovereignty. Pwede mo nang tratuhin yung mga estado na parang bagay lang. So, they are more becoming objects rather than subjects. So, you could now just buy Taiwan. Because you're the millionaire, for instance, you own the system, neoliberalism. Okay, I will now buy the politicians of Taiwan. At dapat sumundan sila sa kagustuhan ko. And always there will be a conflict of interest. That is supposed to be the appropriate term pagdating dito. Nagkakaroon ng conflict of interest, di ba? So for instance, the people, in terms of mining na lang for instance, di ba? Although yung problema kasi sa mining is minsan kasi we are now suiting the preferences of the mining companies instead of the people living on those communities. Para siyang dito, di ba? So you will now buy the politicians, hold the people, then later sell the land, di ba? Which is basically owned by the community. But now, ganun yung pagtrato ng ating companies. Kaya nakikita nyo, no, yung scenario between the government, the state, and your companies. 'di ba? Yung public interest nagko-conflict sa private interest, yung mga private sector natin. That is now a danger. Nagiging imbalance na siya. Yan. Now, there are some arguments against this evil ideology. Sorry, that is my own bias. About this ideology, di ba? Although, let's look into the point. No? So, yung pro would now be madami actually. I just included some proponents. No? So, we have Margaret Thatcher. One of the most prominent prime ministers of United Kingdom. So, she is equated, rather, similar siya kay Miriam Santiago, no? So, she defended neoliberalism on the good points of your laissez-faire economics or system, di ba? Yung sinabi ko sa classical economics that, hayaan mo na yung private sector, doon na lalago yung ekonomiya. Wag kang masyadong makialam gobyerno. Yun yung sinasabi ni Thatcher, no? Kay Rafael Duran, neoliberalism also gives opportunities for your third world countries daw to develop. Kasi third world countries daw, basically, they lack the certain goods and capital daw, di ba? So, kung pina-open natin yung borders ng third world countries, papasok na yung mga capital, yung mga foreign investors, the flow of goods, di ba? Yung mga quote-unquote final product, or it gives a chance for the raw materials to people to buy their raw materials, so nagkaroon daw ng income. Yun daw yung argument daw, no, pagdating sa pro. Although a nice argument would now be the anti, no, so medyo critical siya, no. So Tony Clark, one of the prime ministers as well, states of the Labour Party, states should determine economic, social, and political objectives and not your transnational companies or your MNCs. Sila talaga magde-determine. And yung argument natin lagi dito, guys, is that ano nga ba yung function kasi ng state? It's for the public. Your TNCs are just working towards their self-interest, towards profit. Nakuha na nila yung profit yan, regenerate na profit. Unlike with your states, their main concern would now be towards public service. So sila magde-determine dapat yan at hindi yung mga TNCs or any external entities. So when you look, no, so pro is more likely convergence, no. Neoliberalism converge the world, unify the world. While yung anti-arguments natin would now basically be divergence. Now always remember, no, convergence, divergence, yan yung dalawang theme or argument when we talk about globalization as a whole. Does globalization unify the world, converge the world, or does globalization divides the world? Or diverges the world, di ba? So, yun yung nakikita natin. Now, then another article na sinabi ni Schattle, sorry. Another article na sinasabi ni Schattle would now be the economic and political integration. So, he provided a case, it would now be the European Union. So, dito, ma-label din yung mga issues all about your European Union. The European Union was basically started because of this treaty, which is now your Maastricht Treaty. So it defines that we now create this institution. So the institution is now called the European Union or this political entity. So basically under the Maastricht Treaty, ito yung purpose ng EU, European Free Trade and Economic Cooperation Zone. So both more likely economic, no. Then there are political aims as well, more likely European citizenship. So, ang context dito para siya nag-transcend. What do we mean nag-transcend? Nag-level up. So, hindi na siya British citizen. He could now be a European citizen. And more likely, another reason for your European Union as well, the creation of your European Union, looking into the history of Europe, diba? Europe was crafted because of a lot of war. So, in terms of political aspect, it is now to unify your European countries and to avoid another conflict. The treaty created the euro, so political siya, which is now intended to be the single common currency of the EU and monetary policy set by your European Central Bank. Yan yung nagiging issue, no? But that issue would now be under dun sa global economy natin. Now, issues in your EU, no? So, this is now causes some plurality. So, this is not coming from actually dun sa source. This is sort of one summary that I could include, that nagkakaroon ng conflict between your supranational norms, yung laws of your EU, and your national sovereignty. Now, let us look into your Europe's continental jurisprudence. Now, ganito yan, no? So, under your European continental jurisprudence, we have two courts na ina-analyze ni Schattle, wherein we have European Court of Justice, which now dictates and later challenge yung notion natin all about state sovereignty. EU laws take precedence over national laws. When two set laws come into conflict, members are obligated to follow EU laws. So yung nangyayari dito is that there's already a challenge when it comes to the context of sovereignty. It challenges now yung notion ng state. So ang main objective naman ng EU is to transcend, to make it as another state level. But again, let us look into the definition of the state a while ago that monopolized power. So nagkakaroon ng conflict ngayon, no? Then we have the European Court of Human Rights. Now, yung issue kasi dito sa European Court of Human Rights is that member states or states could initiate cases against each other. So looking into the function of your EU, diba, or your international organizations, it's to converge the world, to converge yung mga member states. However, nangyari dito, are they really unifying yung mga member states, yung mga estado natin? So yun yung nagiging context dito. But looking into the whole, no, for instance, may I give you another example? Looking into the courts kasi, continental jurisprudence, ang nangyari dito is there will now be a conflict, plurality, no, between your national courts, your national laws, your national authority, compared with this international courts or your supranational norms. This is not included in the source, pero to give you an example, would not be yung cases ng Jehovah's Witnesses. Why I gave it as an example? Because this is one of my papers, no. When you look into the cases of Jehovah's Witnesses in Europe, nakikita natin there's a conflict between the ruling of your European Union and yung mga national states, no. For instance, when we talk about France and Russia, so France and Russia has their mandatory military service, no, law, that upon the age of 21 or 18, I forgot yung details about it, that every male shall render military service, no. So this is in the form of ROTC. Now your Jehovah's Witnesses, they refuse to join because they have this context of they are consensus objectors. So pag sinabi natin consensus objectors, they believe that joining the military is wrong against their religion. Now when we talk about law, dapat ano siya, uniform. It should be applicable to all. Then they filed the case. The Jehovah's Witnesses filed separated case in France, then one in Russia. Then tinanggihan nila, no? So the ruling is basically in favor of the state rather than the Jehovah's Witnesses. Then the Jehovah's Witnesses reach out for the courts, for these courts, no, yung lalo na European Court of Human Rights. Then iba yung verdict ng ECHR. Ang lumabas sa ECHR is they are proud Jehovah's Witnesses. Quote and quote yung freedom of religion clause. I forgot already the case, pero just to sum it up. So nagkakaroon ngayon ng different versions or different notions or different rulings yung ating European courts at ating national courts. Now dito na ngayon medyo magtitigasan yung dalawang principle, eh. Dito na magtitigasan yung national sovereignty at supranational norms. So yun yung nagiging konteksto natin, no. So it's an issue of sovereignty. And they could not address this one, di ba? Kasi yung mananaig would always be, if we look it into a state point of view, ang mananaig daw dapat would now be your national sovereignty. So medyo magulo yung example ko, but what the heck. So rise of international law, universal principles, no. Now yung definition dito ni Schattle is basically this would now lead, or rather the creation of your United Nations and other international bodies such as your international criminal courts will now give rise to your international universal principles such as your international humanitarian law, di ba? Yung IHL natin when we talk about human rights. So because of these institutions, it would now give more protection towards every human citizen in the world or other international law universal principle. But yung issues kasi when we talk about these international bodies and their proposed principles, napakaganda. However, as well with your case in the European Union, they never transcend state system. So yung function, di ba? Ito kasi yung notion natin, eh. Yung system of government natin nag-start daw sa local government, barangay, munisipyo, provincial, then national. Then after national, ang notion natin agad, international. Pero hindi ganun yung sistema, eh. Ang nangyari dyan, we stop with the national level. Although may nagawa nga international government, pero ang nangyari dyan, parang hindi siya hierarchical. Ang nangyari dyan is parang nagiging horizontal siya, no? So instead na vertical siya na may hierarchy na international government will now dictate your nation states, ang nangyari dyan is that para siyang ganito. Ka-level nila ang international governments, ka-level nila yung mga national governments natin. At dahil ka-level nila, more likely, hindi ganun na-resolve yung problema. Kasi kunyari, kung may problema yung isang state, usually pag hierarchical yan, sabihan nila isang state, stop it, at susundan na yan ng ating mga state. Kaso hindi yun nangyayari. Yung nangyayari is like horizontal siya, hindi siya vertical, no? And another thing, no, but only serves as a forum between states. Wala siyang authority, wala siyang executory powers. Ang nangyayari dyan is that dito lang kayo magsalita pero bahala na kayo. Then we have responsibility to protect your R2P. Are IOs protect their members or are they really reconciling the conflict between two members? Dapat two yan, sorry, two. Between two or more members, di ba? Kasi when we talk about forum, dapat nagre-reconcile sila. Pero bakit ang nangyayari dyan is sort of lumalala yung conflict. To give an example would now be Russia and Ukraine, di ba? So these two are members of your EU and your United Nations. Pero bakit hindi ma-reconcile ng United Nations yung conflict nito? At it now brings us to the war in Ukraine, no? So yun yung nagiging question natin. And another thing probably would now be yung ISIS intervention, di ba, between Syria. What is happening with Syria? Dapat wini-reconcile ng United Nations yung mga members niya. So pwede nga sabihin na United States stop funding yung mga rebels. While on the other hand, Russia stop funding yung Syrian government in order for the conflict to stop. Pero nangyayari ba yun? So yun nakikita natin sa R2P, no? So lumalabas dyan with my argument with on our lesson on global politics, nagiging futile na yung ating mga international organizations. Then lastly is we have your states as targets. So there's a thing called rise of transnational activism. So this basically refers as the mobilization around collective claims that are related to transnational global issues, formulated by actors located in more than one actor, addressing more than one national and international organizations. So ang ibig sabihin nito is that, may just read it again. Creation of international social movements, we have this boomerang pattern of influence. So to sum up na lang itong lahat, no, kasi magulo na yung discussion ko, is that they are now challenging, that there are some entities that would now challenge the state. It's not just your IOs. But may naman nabubuo ngayon na mga international social movements such as your Green Earth or your Greenpeace movement, no? Ano tong Greenpeace movement? So for instance, environment. They will now challenge your state's authority. Na kunyari, stop fossil fuel. That is an interest of the state, that is an action of the state. However, the states are now pressured by these international organizations and they will now adjust to the pressures provided or pressures given by these international organizations. Or for instance, would now be ISIS, di ba, yung mga Al-Qaeda natin, they're considered to be international social movements. So yung mga terrorist groups natin, no, ISIS, your Al-Qaeda, even your cartels, your drug cartels. Drug cartels, hindi na siya nagiging problema as within the state, nagiging international problem na siya. And they're considered to be entities, they are considered to be international actors which would now challenge yung mga estado natin. So yung nagiging challenge natin all about the state. So I hope medyo naintindihan yun, no? Why I'm laughing kasi medyo ano siya, no? It's hard to sum up yung mga gustong sabihin ni Schattle. But I hope the main points were delivered, were hopefully well delivered, but delivered. Thank you.